a diasporic story, and it happens in France with all the imaginaries of the novel, and they have nothing to do with France. They talk about another country, which is Democratic Republic of Congo, because this is the name I use in the book is the name of Congo, the original name. And I work all these imaginary images, and they are in conflict about how you live in Earth, how you live in France with colonial history, and at the same time you bring other images. There are liberation images that are in conflict with this land, and in this novel is not solved. And when we write novels and fictional novels, we don't need to solve the problems. We can lead them, but not necessarily solve them. And since I graduated in philosophy, I said to myself, what's this conflict about? About living in a real land that is France to me. I'm part of France. And at the same time, bring these images so powerful, these black fireworks of liberation. And I start to cry, with all the names that are advocated by it. And what do I do with it? Philosophically, in this book that I'm writing, and that I hope that will correspond, I think it corresponds to me more. I try to understand this conflict. I don't call it diaspora, I call it loss. So this imaginary of liberation that could not be developed in earth, to the earth to which it was forged. And they are there in the streets, trying to leave in the small cities in the countryside of France. And I try to understand how these powers, these black firefights, got lost and found themselves in these colonial territories. And that's what I'm doing now. And the challenge is to do that these fires do not, are not canceled, erased, or put out.
You are both women who are.
São mulheres que trabalham com.
Yala, you're a scholar, you're a writer, you're a curator of the Kinshasa Biennale in 2020. Abena, scholar, writer, poet, ambassador of Ghana in Brazil. So can you tell us how you articulate these worlds, and if one feeds off the other, or if they're constantly in tension or in opposition, and basically how does it work?
I am now a retired. Sorry. I'm now Professor Emerita, and this is literally my last 2 weeks as ambassador. 2 weeks today, I leave Brazil. That's important because I think my answer is different at the end of my career than it would have been at the beginning. That is to say, as a young academic, I was very conscious of what, I don't know if I felt it or I felt it ought to be or something, a separation between trying to establish myself as a feminist scholar and critic and being a poet. That distinction no longer exists. I'm much more conscious of the fact that they feed off each other and inform each other very, very clearly and critically. I think after 35 years in the academy, I get a phone call from the president of my country when I'm thinking of taking early retirement, who basically says, I want to send you to Brazil, will you go? And I burst out laughing and said, do you think I'm going to say no? I mean, who says no to come to Brazil? So here I am. And I think for me, I've loved being ambassador. It's been a real privilege of my life. But in terms of your question, the big difference is really what you can and cannot say. Yes. As an academic, you're supposed to say what you think. And you say what you think and don't care if people debate it. That's sometimes why you're talking. Let's have a discussion. Challenge this, modify this, help me rethink this. So when you speak as an academic, if you don't get challenged, there's something wrong. Or if you don't expect to get challenged, you're in the wrong profession. There are times when you're an ambassador where if you're going to say something challenging, you should not speak. You know, because you're not speaking as yourself and you're not speaking for yourself. So there are times when literally the fact that you are the ambassador of Ghana could create some kind of diplomatic incident, you know, which you don't want to do. So you hold your peace until you're wise enough and experienced enough to find a way of saying what you want to say without people being able to say they got offended, which is a different kind of skill.
Were there frustration, though? I mean, you just stop telling certain things, but did you feel frustrated at any point in time, or did you think, oh, these two rules are so separate, it's okay to honor both differently?
I didn't feel frustrated. The roles are, you see, there are other avenues. You see, so we're sitting in a forum like this, I'm asked a controversial question that you shouldn't really address, but that doesn't mean you never address it. What that means is you write back to headquarters and ask advice, or you have a private conversation, or there are people to guide you. I have been blessed that here in Brazil, the African group, we're now 35 ambassadors. We're the largest single grouping of ambassadors in Brasilia. And we meet once a month together. And we have our dean is Ambassador Martin Beng, the ambassador of Cameroon, who is very, very wise. So there have been times when I've, faced an issue and then written to Ambassador Beng and said, I need to talk to you, or this is what happened, and this is what I think. And so sometimes he can answer, sometimes he'd say, for this, you need to write back to home and get guidance because it has these implications. So the thing is learning that the answer does not have to be immediate, which in the academy it can be.
Exactly. Thank you. How about you? Navigating all these worlds.
It's about the same. It's about the same. Because about the academical world, I think, yes, it's true. And when the researchers and the academical professors, you have to work a lot to reinforce your freedom of speech. And from this, we can produce works that have value, that really moves people and touch people. First of all, it's difficult to know what is to be independent. And then this independence is not so clear, so transparent. Because even in a university, academical world, and I felt this in France, and in the United States, I was confronted with other things, but in France, okay, we are talking something that we have already talked about, but when you come from minorities, to be a black, an intellectual woman, when you are a minority or belong to a minority, it's expected from you a word careful, don't bother or don't exist. Or you use a word that can validate a system that anyways is going to want your negation. the negation of yourself. In the last 10 years in France and in other countries, I think that in the Western world, the situation was very difficult. From 2018, 2016, I managed to have a role of Master of Conference in Paris 8, giving classes. And so it was published a petition in the Le Trois, a French newspaper, that requested to be careful with all these university students that were producing anti-French ideas. They're colonizers. So the decolonial, the post-decolonial, post-colonial, the ones that work the gender. 2018, I had just entered the university, and I said, no, it doesn't matter. It's just a petition in a small newspaper or in a magazine. I don't know who reads this. Nobody answers. Okay, leave it aside. If there's another petition in the same sense. So you feel this moral panic. You see the old France that faces difficulty to accept these new works of the youngsters. So this moral that is carried by a minority, but that rapidly found a reflect in the government. So all of a sudden, we saw another request of having these persons that were producing the colonial, racial, gender knowledge, queer, LGBT, would be, in a certain moment, responsibilized by what they were saying, and fired from university. So in France, the universities are public. When you are a professor in France, you are a state employee. You are paid by the state, the French state. So, but this went against a lot of people because they asked the intellectuals to be employees, to make function the state machine, to make the discourse produced, not to go against the interests of the country, of France. I never saw this with other colleagues. In my colleagues producing anything that could put in danger the French state. Never saw this, but this question really made me realize that we had a fragility, a vulnerability of the intellectuals in the universities, And at the same time, we had to be attentive to the ideal of academical freedom that was announced in a more transparent way, because what I lived and felt since I entered the university was of a great violence. And now that I'm in the United States, there I arrived in a context last year. The students in the American universities, they don't work in the same way. The American students were very repressed regarding their engagement against the genocide in Palestine. So this has left a lot of marks, a lot of traumatic marks. So I see an ambivalence between the defense of humanity, the republics, the defense of the free world, of the freedom of expression, and the forces of repression that made vulnerable and fragile these collectives. And you have to find words so as not to be destroyed. So in the political context of the Western world that touches us more deeply, it's the extreme right that arrived in the United States, in France. It's a kind of old racist guard and group that now is attacking this university. So in this context, the resistance, the intellectual power, the strength of dying constantly so as not to be destroyed about issues that are crucial and very important. Thank you.
Been in the United States 40 years. And I think there's been a radical change in that time, to the point, I would say, almost of collective schizophrenia. But at the same time, therefore, I had the privilege of being at a university which still upholds certain kinds of things. And I'd like to give an example. My last 6 years at the university, I was chair of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. And we had two of my faculty members who were known radical public intellectuals. One of them, Brittany Cooper, was the founder of the Crunk Feminist. She's a member of my department. And the other, a woman called Jasbir Puar, who is, in her writings, articulates quite clearly the situation of Palestine. And this was, I mean, I've been gone 7 years now, so. Sorry?
Yeah, they can't hear you. You need to.
Oh, sorry. All right. This was it's been 7 years now, so this was a decade ago, at a time when all kinds of things were happening. They were both threatened. Secondly, our building was on the edge of the campus, a little bit isolated. They spent $60,000 upgrading the security system in our building so that we could continue doing the work that we did. They said, we don't have to agree with what they're saying. We have to defend the right of people we have asked to do this work, to defend what they're saying. It was an unusual response, but it was a response that I'm very proud of. And one of the people I was working with, one of the deans, was Jewish himself, you know, but he said, no, my role as dean is to protect my faculty members. And the third thing, they introduced me to the policeman who was attached to our unit. And one day I went into a talk where one of them was speaking, and I recognized he was in plain clothes. I was surprised. He said, oh no, every time one of them is speaking on this campus in my jurisdiction, I will be there. And he was.
Fantastic. I mean, there are people, it means there are people. Yeah. Who are actually supporting and supportive. I just wanted to add to this the fact that more or less the same things are happening in France, in the US, but also in the UK. I mean, I'm based at SOAS, and it's been really interesting times. It has to do with the context and what they call the getting rid of the woke people and the wokerati, as they call us. But there's also something else, which is to do with the kind of people they're targeting at university as academic, as Black women. I remember there's one thing that is interesting is that if you Google me, it's virtually impossible for you to find my details and my email address. It's one of the things that the university has made sure, because the email address were completely full of nonsense. It goes from the usual racist thing to death threats and to involving the police for that. And in some places, in previous institutions, it was impossible for students, so people outside the university to know where my office was, just for safety reasons. So it's not just disagreement, it's actually people targeting you to harm you, and even receiving letters with some form of cyanide and acid in the letters. I mean, people are just crazy. But you know what? There's resistance, there's support, and there are mechanisms to come together and fight against this. And it's really important to also remember that we're not alone. I had this question about, let's move to Beatrix Nascimiento's words. We talked about the many hats, but Beatrice had this definition and these words about the Atlantic woman, or Atlantic women, and women working across the Atlantic, Europe, Africa, the Americas, the Caribbean, the multiple locations, and the fact that they constantly body in movement. And these are things that you find as themes in your work. So can you tell us a bit more if it resonates with you and how it does so? Oh, before we do that, I had this question, sorry, a follow-up question, which was about philosophy in France, because philosophy has a very strange place in France, and philosophers, white male philosophers, see themselves as the upholding truth in whatever else they're upholding. And here we have this woman who's a top philosopher, and yeah. And I want you to share with us, specifically in philosophy, what it means to be you in that space.
Parfois, and sometimes I can be really brutal. And I say to myself that there is a sentence that always comes to my mind when I talk about my journey in philosophy. And I think that I've crossed philosophy as we cross a corridor where people are, saying bad words to you. And I don't want to victimize myself, but now this is very hard when people insult me and I don't believe in what they say. So if they say some bad words to me, I don't believe I'm that, what they say. But when they repeat it every day that you're this and that, this, affects you. And it's necessary to find a way, the resources to not to be attacked. And my resource, my tool, might be strange after everything we have said, was loneliness. And loneliness was mandatory, but at the other side, loneliness, solitude, there is this refusal to university validation through the eyes of my parents, their approval. And in this solitude, I could feed my desire of independence and my will to not to be considered as someone like this, and the risk to be taken to tell these people that treat me that like a small thing. I want to prove to them that I'm not that small, and I think that it's really destructive, because in the end of the day, we start to integrate their patterns as our own patterns. So you participate at your destruction. So solitude, maybe it's not the best answer for me. Maybe the collectiveness, the community. But for me, solitude, and I found myself in a situation that to answer to this situation, to what people think about me, I had to prove to myself that I was not what they were saying. And I built this space where I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. And sometimes I could, leave this space because you cannot be alone all the time, of course. And I talked to other Black women in university, especially in Colombia. And what was hard is that regardless of the diplomas and degrees you have, the excellence you have achieved, it is rarely recognized, and you're constantly being opposed by a double incapacity, because of your body, because the knowledge, the type of knowledge you bring. And when you start to talk, nobody wants to hear your voice, the value, the beauty, the gold that come out of your mouth as words, and being constantly taken to the institute of something small, to the status of something small. People saying that, why are we interviewing her? She's not going to be a professor, And as a professor, I say some things that are interesting. And maybe sometimes a joke, When I was recruited to the university in the same period, this intellectual evolution in Africa. There were these Dakar workshops founded by intellectuals. I had participated at some of them, and there was a French channel journal that interviewed me and asked me, "You are a professor now, recruited at the university. You teach African philosophy in a French university. What's that about?" And I answered in a very calm way. And then I went back to the university the other day. Met my colleagues, and what they said to me is that now I was passed to from philosophy to telereality because I had answered to questions in an interview during about the African continent and the importance that that could have for me inside the French university. So all the things and not being, destroyed by all these things they were saying to me. Now you were now have no competence. You were small, so you have to find these tools not to get yourself destroyed to prevent it.
There's so much violence in that country. It is also my country, by the way, France. But there's also there's so much violence that for most people it's always surprising, that level of unhingedness. My question for you, coming back to Beatrix's kind of work, she talks about Atlantic women, and I would like you to kind of explain to me or tell me if it resonates with you, the kind of space she evolved in. It's the notion of space. You inhabit a space and you transform that space, or you don't transform that space. But did you feel that you had these? Did you feel that you had you had these connections with the space every time you moved? It's not just an emotional connection, but something deeper, which is you're mutating into the space, or the space is changing you. How did it work for you?
You know, one of my earliest poems, I think I was about 16 when I wrote it. And I'm not very good at remembering poetry, even my own, so I might quote it wrongly. But it goes something like, "All my friends are exiles. Born in one place, we live in another, and with real sophistication, enter spaces where you would not expect to find us. With a plum and a command of languages, we stride across continents with the confidence of those of us who know with absolute certainty where they come from. With the globe at our command, we have everywhere to go but home."
Fantastic. Yeah, I have to digest the poetry. Do you have anything you want to add to the space that you inhabit? And I'm saying this because we started having this conversation about the spiritual, but I'm thinking suddenly the space is also the space between words and curating, between the objects, the space where you create, but also the space where you create your words, and you do did you have this feeling that you have to be in specific spaces to be able to create specific kind of knowledge, even your novel? Where did you write it?
I will start with novel because I think it's really concrete and also history. I write a lot. I write slowly, and I deal with people that are really maniacal with this thing of rewriting. So I draft it first, which is never satisfactory, and then I rewrite it and rewrite it. So it's a very crazy process, and sometimes I have to stop. I don't know how because I'm tired. So it takes a lot of time, and I remember that this novel I wanted to finish in a certain place, a particular city where I hadn't be able to go back to during years, Kinshasa city. And then I found myself being a curator for the Kinshasa Biennial, and I had my manuscript. And instead of stopping, I started to rewrite. And the novel that had to finish, in Kinshasa on September 17 in 2002, it never happened. So it's like Paris on November 17th. So the novel, when we're working with it, we bring spaces that we want, in which we want to be. They are precise and concrete that give life to our words. And what I notice from this intellectual work is that due to the places where I am, and my thought is not the same, and doesn't work the same way that works. The words do not affect me the same way, do not affect the same way. I don't read others the same way. So it's terrible when you are a philosopher, because in general, when you are a philosopher, people expect from you that your brain produces some, enlightening ideas, the truth that will never change because of geography and history. But my relation with thoughts has nothing to do with this. My thought in the end is always moving, it never stabilizes. And what can write when I'm in France is not the same when I am somewhere else. I don't know if it's what you asked me, but it's amazing.
French now. We need to go back to English. I had this.
Eu estou mudando para francês, vou voltar para inglês. E eu tinha essa pergunta quando você falou de exílio, né? Abner, que você.
Well, we're going to the spiritual realm and spirituality, and exile, rootedness, either geographical or metaphorical, are the main themes in your body of work. But I was really interested in this notion of exile, especially women who often arrive in Western desecrated place, where attachment to the sacred is met with disdain, and that creates a kind of wound that follow these women. So can you expand on that, please?
I'll try, but it's complicated because there are so many perspectives on this, and I have to begin with the question: how many of us as women still consider our bodies sacred? Really? And if we consider our bodies sacred, how does that translate into how we behave and how we treat our bodies? Who has access, who does not, etc. I'll set that aside for the minute and go to a kind of larger question which can be dealt with without necessarily dealing with it in your own personhood. And that is, yes, first of all, a lot of so-called ancient civilizations, and I say so-called because not everywhere has this changed, all right? Make a real correlation between the body of the earth and the body of the woman and the body of the mother, which is why in so many, I don't know why I've suddenly started getting a buzz, which is why in so many civilizations, the first representation of the deity is not God the Father, but God the Mother. I think there's a reason for that. We can have a huge debate, but in so many societies, the representation of divine remains gendered female, articulated female. And so many of us today grow up in, monotheistic, Judeo-Christian, etc. societies, we forget, but I'm always struck, for example, how late in history the idea of a male monotheistic God is. And if you read, like if you're a Christian, for example, if you read it carefully, right? You know, there's that story of St. Paul in Athens, for instance, and that riot, great is Artemis of the Athenians. All right, who is Artemis? So we're talking now 30 or so years after the death of Jesus. Well, don't want to offend anybody. I'll say the death of Jesus of Nazareth. There's no dispute about that historical figure. But the point I'm trying to make is, in historical time, that is several thousands of years after the children of Israel have been trying to defeat this unruly female goddess. And she reappears all the time, Astarte, whoever, and there she is still bothering St. Paul. So, you know, there's that sense. But then there's also the sense that indigenous peoples have. I just came from Colombia, from COP16, and the president of Colombia in his speech, which was a very, very brave and courageous speech, really challenging the commercialization in which we structure the capital regime in which we live, pointed out that indigenous peoples consider oil the blood of the earth. Now, if you think about that, and you really think about what it means to what we do and do not do with blood, one of the things we don't do is bleed it out. One of the things we do not do is just keep extracting blood. It gives a whole different concept. And if you are of a culture where that earth that contains that blood is also represented as female. Amongst my father's people, the name of one of the names of the divinity is Asasiya, literally Mother Earth, etc. So there's that whole other perspective, confluence of things that even articulates the divine as female, as earth-giving, as blood-flowing, etc., etc., etc. Now, the interesting thing that happens, though, is in so-called post-Enlightenment society. I've never understood why that period was philosophically called the Enlightenment. It seems like the start of the Dark Ages to me. But when we get the primacy of the rational mind, which then leads to the denigration of the body that gets most denigrated is, of course, the black woman's body. The combination of Enlightenment thinking, the rise of racism, which then becomes structural. And we live in a world in which we're so used to the notion of the classifications of race that we forget that it has not always been so in every part of the world. It just hasn't, and it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it. But then, you then have to deal with, and this is where my writing began in a sense, the ways in which you occupy a body which is always contaminated. Sometimes you're happy if you're not seen. I mean, I don't know how people don't see us, but sometimes people seem to literally not see us. You're standing in line and waiting for something, and somebody will come and walk in front of you. And if you protest, they say, "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you." And I think I'm a, 5'4" black woman in a brightly colored coat. How did you manage not to see me? But sometimes it's a relief not to be seen because of what happens to you when you are seen. And that's the kind of degradation, diminution, what it does to the soul, the denial of the self and what it does to the soul. I'll stop there because I'm talking too long, but one of my first works was precisely on this issue of the disappearing of Black women from certain kinds of spaces.
Yeah.
And spaces where, in fact, we are the originary voice, but, we cannot afford to acknowledge your presence.
This is so powerful. It's like I've been in a classroom where I had like one semester of teaching about gender deity, but also the visible, invisible, invisibilization of Black women and the sacred desecration of women's body as well, particularly Black women. And I was really interested in this actually gave me some food for thought to move on to the question that is an answer to hers, which is, we're talking about, the question today was about decolonizing God and God singular. And I was wondering if you had some thoughts about it. I know you do, because we had a very heated conversation about this. But quite often when you say God, there's a whole lot of things attached to it, which are, among others, religion. So can you expand on the links between religion, God, and spirituality? Because they're not quite the same, are they?
Est-ce que je peux rebondir?
Eu vou falar pouco. I'm going to talk a little bit about what was said before, because I thought it was very strong what she said about body and how body was degraded, diminished in the modern history. I remember there was a time in which I got interested in the work of Janina Ribeiro, with whom I have already worked. I have a lot of contact. She went to France. I couldn't be at her presentation because I was taking care of my children, but I followed the live streaming of the presentation. And when there were the questions and answers and the reactions of her presentation, I remember one sentence of a woman in the audience that she said something in a very hard way. These racism stories of violence regarding women make me think to be a spirit and not live in my body anymore. So the issue of reincarnation, because some forms of violence makes the person not desirable itself, but also make the person not feel embodied, because to touch someone, to hug someone, to eat, to feel the flavors pass through the body. What I was thinking while she was speaking is that even this wasn't worthy. She preferred to limit herself in something evanescent that was the spirit, the pains and the wounds because of all of this. So in this framework, the political thought would let us to think this body we have to defend, because if we want to install ourselves in the world with this flesh and muscles, we need to use it, and we have to keep this body to fight. If you treat me as an object without dignity, I'm going to respond, black is beautiful. Black is beautiful. But even this, if my body is not worth anything, I just give up my body. But the integrity, the power of what I am is my soul. It is a spirit. Even if this body dies, this is going to resist. That's what she was saying. And I thought this was of a huge violence, because it was an act of renouncing oneself. And what she was saying, that at the moment that she chose matter, reality, what we could touch, was also a way to say that we don't destroy the capacity of creation, of imagination, of resistance of a person if you hadn't destroyed the spirit of this person yet. So there are stories of resistance. This resistance is physical, and they are fed by the way the fire burns inside the soul, inside the spirit. This makes me think of this story. Sorry, I passed to French. I switched to French.
To choose, though, can we inhabit a place where neither the spiritual nor the body are temples? Well, it's for both of you.
Can I? Yeah. On aurait choisir. Moi, j'ai
intellectual, and this bothers me a lot because in a certain moment, the resources that are requested for this word, I'm not talking only about representation, I'm talking about deep transformation of the word that feeds us, really in the real sense, because we have a land, an earth that feeds us. It's going to strengthen our health, but also feeds our soul in the sense that we belong to a collective in which we take part, where we can enrich ourselves. So to be in a situation of dualism in which in one side we have the body and the other the spirit is a disappointing situation. But we are talking about this, and there is an article of Frederick Douglass, Memories of an enslaved person, an enslaved man. I don't remember exactly when. And the text, he talks about a crazy moment in which he is enslaved in the plantation of his owner, countermaster, and he rebels and he attacks the owner, and the countermaster doesn't react. Nothing happens with Frederick Douglass. And what Frederick Douglass writes in his memoirs is the description of this day. And writing this day, my body was in a slave situation, but the soul was of a free man. And this story of the possible freedom, that it's possible to feed it all the time, concretely, because the spirit is a reality that reacts, and not necessarily being this dual situation, body on one side, spirit on the other. In certain moments, to free the body, you need a potentiality that it's not material, and we need to tell these stories. And the words that we have are small: body, spirit, matter. So we really have to be able to tell about these horrible situations in which the body is an obstacle. There is someone else that shows us other spaces and that life is possible. Thank you very much.
Mais on va revenir, en fait. Je fais un...
Vamos fazer aqui um ping-pong. Eu gostaria de falar uma coisa aqui. Não é, na verdade, uma reação, é respeitosamente voltar para as mulheres que eram deidades. Se nós considerarmos que nós estamos falando do feminino e que essa deidade
How can we place deity outside these gendered?
Deidade fora.
And a lot of faiths do. Either it's outside or it's dual or what. I mean, there are multiple ways of representing God. And there always have been. I was talking about a particular trajectory because it is the trajectory that leads to the post-colonial condition that we are facing. That is to say, though in Africa we were not colonized by China or India, or, you know, so I was talking about a particular Judeo-Christian that comes through the Western Enlightenment, blah, 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 that ends up organizing our schools and our universities and writing our constitutions, etc. So that's what I was speaking from, the historical moment that we have to negotiate, the ideas that we have to negotiate. So when we as Black women have to articulate, pick up our pen, etc., from this particular condition, whether we are talking literally about the gods, a god or sacredness, we are talking metaphorically out of a space in which that idea has filtered down and constructed the space out of which we write. That's what I was trying to grapple with. So this wasn't a definitive theological statement. It was a tracing of a particular history.
Okay, let me go that way then. Can we access spirituality or deity or spirituality rather in a way that is not us as women or as non-binary, in a way that is not gendered?
Yes, I think we can, but I think today it takes a lot of work. I mean, that is to say, it takes a particular strategic decision and consciousness to challenge certain kinds of things. It can be quiet, but it must be conscious. You know, one of the things that, all right, there's this story, right, about an old fish swimming in the sea who goes past two young fish playing around and so on, and they greet him, and the old fish says to them, nice, how's the water today? And the fish, when the old fish has gone by, the two young fish look around at each other and say, what's water? That is to say, the thing that is hardest to see is the thing you take for granted. Okay, what shapes the world? These two fish have no understanding of anything other than water because they're swimming in it. What I'm trying to say is we live in a world where certain things have become so institutionalized, we don't even think about it. And if we want to change them, we have to think about it. And this is everything. I'll tell one story, all right? Because it has to do with, I'm an educator, I'm passionate about education, but it has to do even with educational philosophy. In most of our schools, at least in the United States, if you're in an undergraduate classroom, you walk in and the class it's like this, okay? Everything's facing this way and you're on a raised platform. We take it for granted. What does that mean? What is being said? What is being said is that you have come to listen to this authority, and that's the way knowledge is disseminated. Most graduate classes, we're seated around a table. Yeah, because it is acknowledged, but by the time you reach graduate school, you're ready to have a debate. It's a simple thing, we don't think about it, but even the architecture and the interior design of certain spaces is giving a particular message. And then I once did a workshop. I do a lot of faculty development workshops on race and gender. And I was once had the privilege of working with an indigenous, he was a Cherokee educator, who spoke about how he had been born on a reservation and had, gone out into the big wide world, been educated in one of the great Western universities, East Coast University of the United States, returned to the reservation. And he was administering exams one day, and he had a really bright kid who he saw was, passing his answers around, And as a teacher, he knew that not only was the person getting the answers going to fail, but his brightest kid in this school was going to fail. And he spoke to this boy afterwards. And you know what this 9-year-old said to him? He said to him, "But teacher, I thought we were all here to work together so that we could all progress and be together next year. And if you've taught me something and I've learned it, what's wrong with me helping my peers so that they can also pass this exam and we all graduate together?" He didn't see himself as teaching, as cheating. He thought himself as of a subsidiary. He thought he was just carrying on the work of the teacher because he did not have the notion of a hierarchical notion of exams. We're in the same class, but I've got to beat you. He said, no, why? The object of the exercise is for us all to reach, get through to 12th grade. I've learned something faster than him. I'm going to help him. So, how many of us question even the way in which we're educated to achieve a certain kind of success? I just tell those two stories because those ideas are part of the water that we don't see. So what I'm saying is that when Black women take up certain kinds of engagements, we need to learn to see the water we don't see.
So the water would be the decolonial tool. Amen. So this one is an interesting one and a really, really important question, which is, are there places in your body of work that you could relate to Nacimiento's Quilombo, meaning a liberated space, a technology of social life and self that is not just about resistance, but also about rest, community, friendship, love, family? We spend a lot of time fighting. How about those spaces, the liberated spaces?
It's a beautiful question, and I will start with history. Because in bibliotheques, where we go, in my bibliothèque, I have a bit of everything, and also reactionary thinkers. I read a lot, but there is a thinker, a philosopher that I started to read again, and I think he is reactionary. No, not really. It's really reactionary. It's really nationalist. I don't think I am a reactionary nor a nationalist, but produced an utopic machine, vertiginous ones, and insisting by saying that being free is to rest. And rest after so many years of slavery, destruction, exploration. And this resting philosopher is Marcus Garvey. And he wrote in his speeches, he talks about Bob Marley, and Bob Marley has some words, quotes Marcus Garvey in his songs. And there is a speech he gave in New York, and it's found in his book, Philosophy of Marcus Garvey. It is a book that was created by his wife and his hearers of his philosophy. And his speech he gave in Madison Square Garden, and a lot of things happened in there. But in 1924, he said something very strong. He says, "What I search is the land of refuge. And this land of refuge, the land of resting, is a space. And this is the African continent, particularly Liberia. And I don't want to talk about it because it's a violent story. But what's interesting is that in the speech of many black nationalist thinkers, the issue was to pose this question: if you escape from race, where can we go? Not to be constantly talking about this negativity. Where can we go to re-signify our existence from the land where they got us from? They extracted us. So all his reflection, Marcus Garvey developed the idea of returning to Africa, back to Africa through these ships, this Black Star Line ship. And he moves me so much. But, back to the Africa continent, Africa should be a land for refuge. And Garvey is an author that people don't read anymore for reasons that I could also mention here, because this concept of race is strange. For him, I'm not black, I'm biracial, so it's kind of hardcore. But what is interesting is that this thought circulated and how it is, refounded. He encountered now in the 20s, Belgians who colonized Congo were afraid of some things. They were afraid that black people would be contaminated by Marxism and Garveyism, because that was his spirituality, kind of Christian Congo religion. It was a black Christianism and a black adaptation of Christianism done by Simon Congo, a prophet in Congo, that said that one day white wouldn't be authority anymore and black would be in the front line, and develop this imagination of, that the Americans would come with ships and help to free Africa. So some years later, during the independence, it was interesting to see that from the African continent, diasporas were summoned. They talk about independence in Africa. It's something in Africa, but no, history, the big tasks, this is not about African history. That's not complicated. The diaspora is complicated. And in the independent Africa, what could it offer? It should offer to Africans a land that is not hostile, which means something that is not a colony, and also be a land that we gather together families and gather families that were separated. The independence is a reparation, You read Gruma. The independence is one of the powers, the spiritual powers, and it means that we'll make Africa a land of refuge for all the sons that are spread. So when I feed myself from this discourse, this speech that are not from the past, it's the notion of independence. It transports me, takes me, and we can use it, reread it, reuse it. And from that concept, I think about what would be this land of refuge. where a land where you don't wait for liberation because it already exists, and families are not torn apart or separated by oceans, you know, and because of the deepening of this wound, a land that is not a place of extraction, where if just as if they were, you know, extracting blood, but a land that feeds. And we find it in texts independent about independence. And when I wrote my novel, I was fed about for this, because all novels try to kill like a quilombo, a land in which in the outskirts of Paris, for instance, you have some things. If you get out from Paris and go to another neighborhood in France, the city hall painted an uncut out fresco in the middle of the city, so you can go there and run, jog, make your jogging, and you have this experience by looking at this mural. It's a new quilombo, you know, that you can buy, you know. And there are these quilombos in these great cities, and they are known by the inhabitants as independence, a land of refugee where their lives will never be diminished. And the specifics of this land are the invisibility. If you want to be free, if you don't want to be caught, you have to learn to camouflage yourself. And that's where French cities with their buildings, you know, I don't know if you know them, they really look like, you know, big cities of cement. So thank you.
Thinking about, there are so many things I want to ask you, and and one of the things that I found really powerful is the link between spirituality and remembering, spirituality and knowledge production, and spirituality and transmission. So these things, you find them in your work, and if you can expand on that would be great. But the last point I want to make is, what advice would you give to young writers, to young scholars, to young thinkers, to people who are not part of university, but who are thinkers still?
A couple of quick answers. First of all, as a writer, you learn so much about your own writing when other people talk about it. One of the best essays I've ever read about my own work pointed out things that I was doing that I was not so conscious I was doing until I read this young student's essay for somebody else's class, and I thought, wow, you know, this is really good. So that's to say, it's not always easy. You can sometimes reflect backwards on your own work. It's not, for me anyway, I'm not always as conscious. I write from somewhere else, you know. I write from a different space, I guess. And so I see the patterns in retrospect, not necessarily as I'm in process. I have a simpler answer to the question you asked before.
Spirituality and remembering?
No, to the question the wonderful answer she gave. And that was, I was thinking of, under what conditions do I manage not to start a work, but finish a work?
No, it's the mic.
Oh.
Closer, please.
I can't get much closer unless I put it in my mouth, you know. And that is, when I think of a work, I'm not necessarily in a space of peace, but when I finish a work, I have to be. And that space of peace is a space where I feel supported. And I have three supports. I always give the family, friends, faith. Family, friends, faith, by 3 Fs. And for example, I'm just working on a piece. It's now where I realize, for instance, one of the things that has happened to me is seeing myself as a poet in a space of community. A community that I don't feel I had when I started writing 40 years ago. But it has to do with, you know, I don't know how many of you know this amazing series of books called New Poets from Africa, edited by Chris Abani and Kwame Dawes. They realized that a lot of African poets were not being published because their volumes were slim and not commercially viable. So about 8 years ago or so, they started running a competition, and then they would publish 8 slim poems in a hardback case as a collection, because that's commercially viable. I think they started off with 7, the last number they had 12, and a lot of those small chapbooks that people have now gone on to publish bigger. For various reasons, I was reading these to write an article, and I realized, for example, one of the things I think that has changed since I started writing is the notion of Africa. That is to say, for the generation before me and my generation, Africa was home, even if it was missing. The last line of my Exiles poem, we have everywhere to go but home. But we have a generation of writers like you, for whom home is the African diaspora. It's a radical but very crucial shift. But for somebody like me, I learned so much from those poets because I realized they opened up for me a different space of possibility and identity. And things that caused angst 40 years ago no longer do, because the generation of my children have taught me another way of being, which has been so very valuable. And they gave me a space to be as a poet, which has been so valuable to me, you know.
I love that. It's fantastic. Thank you so much. It's hopeful as well. I have the question I want to kind of end up with is to do with here. We talk space, we talk Atlantic, we talk bodies, we talk movements. What is your relationship with Brazil, with Rio, with now? What kind of connections have you created?
Ah, j'ai envie d'enseigner ici.
I'd like to teach here. In reality, Brazil is a country that has always existed. It's a huge country. And I remember a moment, a precise one, in which I told myself that something is happening there for me. I was in Paris, and there was this exhibition about contemporary artists from Congo, and it was in 2014, I believe. And I invited a lot of other artists to join, not only from Congo. And I invited them to go. I was in a panel with a Brazilian artist that lived in France, Fabiana de Souza. Fabiana A. Souza, because she took Souza out of her name, so it's A. Souza. And she did something unimaginable. She created a film, a video, and I remember exactly what it was about, but rituals of people that were speaking what was my father's language, and they were mobilizing practices. They were saying from Pakongo people, which is my originary people, and I was saying, oh my God, what's that? And we became friends very fast, and I started to romanticize my relation with the African diaspora because of this, and I started to think that I had a whole family living in Brazil, because the part in Central Africa that was invaded by Portuguese in 1483, when they took possess of the River Congo, and that's when they started kidnap people from Congo and destroy democracy and the Christianity, the colonial Christianity arrived, and the Pacongo slaves that were taken through these Atlantic routes and saw themselves in Haiti and the plantations there, and also in Brazil, the plantations in Brazil. So there is this whole story about the Congo populations that were written in Brazil. And that was a very important moment to tell another story. And I always remember that this land is important for my father because my father is really attached to Congo's culture. And he saw himself in very intense diasporic spaces. And they were constantly dialoguing with Cuba, people in Brazil, Haiti, with a huge community, Congo community. So to simplify it, it's always in terms of family, you know. And when I became friends with Janira Ribeiro, it's not because we were colleagues, activists, or philosophers, but her Anne is my cousin. And this is really romantic in some certain sense. I love this idea, you know. Maybe I have cousins here amongst you, you know, people that are heirs of this family that with whom I could share a meal. E nós tivemos livros traduzidos em português, vocês precisam ler. Ela teve. Isso é a relação também conosco, né?
Read it in Portuguese, but never mind, that's a different story. Yes, how about you?
Well, I arrived in Brazil 7 years ago as ambassador. But I'm an ambassador resident in Brazil, accredited to the whole continent. My mission serves all 12 countries of continental South America. But of those 12 countries, 9 are Hispanic. The 3 that are not, Brazil is a former Portuguese colony, Suriname, a former Dutch colony, and Guyana, a former British colony. That is the history of my country. As traders, the Portuguese came first. The oldest stone structure on the African coast is Elmina Castle, built by the Portuguese between 1484 and 1488. They traded out of there until they were kicked out by the Dutch, fighting a proxy war. The Dutch were fighting a proxy war against the Portuguese. So at the time they took over Elmina, they took over Recife. And then they subsequently handed over to the British. So I arrive and I think, oh my goodness, you know, every Ghanaian who arrives in Salvador feels like they're at home. The food, the origins of the music, the aesthetics, all of those things. And those places, Salvador and Recife, you know, there is a community in Accra, in our capital city, who we call the TAMBÉM, from Estabon. Because although you are aware in Brazil that a number...
Saiba no Brasil que número de pessoas que se libertaram, voltaram para o oeste da África, você também está consciente daqueles que voltaram para a Nigéria e para o Benin. E que eram de 12 famílias importantes que vieram para o Ghana. Eles se estabeleceram no Ghana. E se hoje você for lá,
the community called the TAMBÉM, they have their own chief, They changed the history of Accra. They did things like our first story private houses were built by them. The first men's fashion, bespoke men's tailoring that brought, elite 19th century European tailoring from Europe through Brazil to Ghana. The economy of Ghana for the last 120 years has been based on cocoa. Our first cocoa trees came through Fernando Po. The Brazilian came through Fernando Po and we know the person, the sailor who brought the coffee beans from Fernando Po. So I arrive in Brazil, I feel so at home. Even your crazy politics is familiar. It's nothing new. Your soldiers left only 4 years before our soldiers left. We're about to have our 9th election in the Fourth Republic. The soldiers have not come back. They don't want to come back. We have had no people like your former president who wants to bring them back. But even the ways of trying to transform yourselves into a stable economy are familiar. We have a lot to learn from you. You're so much bigger. I mean, every time I have to remind myself that I'm the ambassador of a country which is the size of, I think, your second smallest state, Rondonia, with a population the size of your largest city. I mean, you have a city, Sao Paulo, greater Sao Paulo with its 32 million people is the size of my country. So there are some scales that we can't grasp, but I am in love with Brazil. I am traumatized that I have to leave in 2 weeks' time, and I will be back.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this session. That's it. Take care.
Que grande encontro tivemos agora nessa mesa, né? Essas 3 mulheres falando das suas